One of the fundamental innovations that the classical liberals had in trying to create a government that was a servant of the people was to acknowledge that power flows from the people to the Constitution, and then from the Constitution to the government. This is one of those things where, strictly speaking, they failed because they left a bunch of coercive elements in their conception of government. But there's actually something here that I think is worth noting and is worth talking about with respect to existing governments. So, hello everybody and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about, mostly jury nullification. This will be a short one. This was inspired by an episode of the Path to Liberty podcast with Michael Bolden and the 10th Amendment Center called Even the Law Isn't Above the Law. I saw this video and I had this kind of train of thought on it that I think is something that might be worth talking about. So here we go. It's the October 22nd episode. I will put a link in the description so that you can go check that video out. It is a very fun one. So one of the major legal theorists of the era of the start of the Constitution is James Wilson. He was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court before it went all Marbury versus Madison, and he said this. He has a book of lectures on law from 1789 through 1791, and he says this, quote, "This revolution principle, that the sovereign power residing in the people, they may change their constitution and government whenever they please, is not a principle of discord, rancor, or war. It is a principle of amelioration, contentment, and peace. It is a principle not recommended merely by a flattering theory. It is a principle recommended by happy experience. To the testimony of Pennsylvania, to the testimony of the United States, I appeal for the truth of what I say." In 1787, he gave a speech at the Pennsylvania Convention, and he said this, quote, "The truth is that, in our governments, the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power remains in the people. As our constitutions are superior to our legislatures, so the people are superior to our constitutions. Indeed, the superiority in this last instance is much greater, for the people possess over our constitutions control in act as well as in right," end quote. So, one of the things I try to do a lot is I try to bring up, evidence-based reasons why you can say that this government has overstepped the boundaries of what a proper classical liberal government would do, or would be able to do, right? And we can find all kinds of examples of these in just modern life, right? We can even say things like, the thing is, though, that, Locke offered taxation as a possibility. And people who, and I'm working on some stuff about these, pillars of coercion in classical liberalism, but here I want to focus down right on this idea of the people being superior to the Constitution. Now, what this means is that the final judge of the Constitution, of the law, cannot actually be the courts, but there must be some way for the people to exert some kind of ability over the government, over the courts, in interpreting and saying, no, this is not what we hired you to do. When you do this, you are not serving us, you are harming us, right? And so the example that I mentioned a bit ago was Marbury versus Madison, basically a decision that today, what that decision basically means is that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter on what the Constitution means. And, of course, that is a case of the government saying that it is above the Constitution, that the government will say what the Constitution says. As you can see, that power is flowing in the wrong direction. Now, the way that this would have worked originally would be that the states, representing the people of those states, would say, no, this is not what we signed up for when, we signed up for the Constitution. And, if you don't do what the Constitution says, then we'll have to secede or something. Of course, at this point, secession is totally forbidden. So, that's not an option anymore. But there's also one other thing that I think is worth at least kind of, showcasing as to how we can show that the modern government does not believe that it is bound by the Constitution that it claims in order to more effectively, fleece you, that it is bound by. Here we go. The way that the courts treat jury nullification is a way that you can determine that the government has decided that its power does not flow from the people anymore, right? If the power must flow people, constitution, government, including courts, right? Then for the people to make a plebiscite decision on what the Constitution means must therefore bind the government, or else, if not, the government has overstepped its boundaries, at least according to the Lockean framework, the Wilsonian framework in this sense. And what do we see today? Well, we see that if you go into a court and you say the phrase jury nullification, or even just the word nullify in some cases, that court will throw you out. They might even try to cite you for contempt. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because if you say things that sound like nullification, not only do you get removed from the possible, existence, on a jury, but you also get blacklisted from serving on a jury from thereafter. That's what happened to me. If you go in and they say, well, are you going to, uphold the law as it is written? And you say, no, my conscience is more important than the law, then you just don't ever get jury duty again. And there you go. But that behavior, I'm arguing here, is something that shows that the government has placed itself above the people and above the Constitution in a very distinct and measurable way. In fact, in a properly run classical liberal Lockean style government, the court would be required to remind you that you in fact have the power to nullify the law by saying that this is not something someone should be punished for. But of course, the situation we live in today is the exact opposite. And that means that we are not living in this kind of, idealized Lockean kind of situation, but in fact, we've moved into kind of a Rousseauian totalitarian nightmare. So, I don't know. That was my thought for today. I've got this thing. So right now I'm doing two things. One is that I'm just finishing up an essay that might get sent to Mises about Dominion itself. I had a fun idea about that, so I'm working on that. And that'll eventually be a video or something over on the blog. But number two, I'm working on trying to kind of classify like the smallest number of possible things that the government does that are themselves coercive. And this sounds like a stupid thing to do, maybe, I don't know, but like, I like to put things in boxes. I like to make systems. And so if I can say that, hey, these are the 6 things that a government does that move it from being a voluntary government to a coercive state, then I feel there's some value to making those distinctions and definitions. So I'm working on that. I have an outline and the different pillars, but trying to figure out a way to actually kind of put them together into a relatively tractable video is a little bit more difficult. So anyway, that's what I got for today. Happy Halloween, everybody, and I hope you have a good weekend, and I will see you next time with whatever it is I end up thinking of. Anyway, have a good one. See you later.